Go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn on Inclusive Leadership. I'm Chastity Cooper, Coordinator for Equity and Inclusion, and I would like to briefly introduce our presenter today. Currently, Dr. Angela Webster serves as the Chief Diversity Officer and Associate Vice President for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Central Arkansas. And she also holds the rank as Associate Professor of Leadership Studies. Dr. Webster has authored newsletters, journal articles, book chapters, and books, including In the Presence of a King, about her childhood experience of witnessing the final speech of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She is an educator, a licensed school administrator, and earned her PhD in educational psychology from the University of Memphis. Dr. Webster has been a leader in K through 12 as founder principal of 2 independent schools, the designer of a public charter school, and an executive coach, consultant, and school board member. On a personal level, Dr. Angela served as a faculty member and a dissertation committee member for me. So everyone, let's welcome Dr. Angela Webster.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. I'm very tickled to be in your presence. Great to see you again, and great to be a part of this session today. I also want to give gratitude to Dr. Keith Johnson, who I've recruited with for years now, and who's become just a well-respected colleague and friend. So thanks to each of you for being here. And I hope during our time together, we can meet at our points of resonance to link up, to learn about, and to lead inclusively. So by show of hands, how many of you consider yourselves to be a leader? Okay. And would you say that you're an informal leader? Raise your hand for that. Or you are an official formal leader? Okay, most formal. Okay, good deal. And of course, there are many theoretical definitions of leadership. And as a student of leadership and as a professor of leadership, I could give you some very long flowing definitions of leadership. But what I will do is just to give you one that Maya Angelou shared, and that's that a leader is someone who wants to work with others to make a difference. And so as we reflect upon inclusive leadership, it's important for us to start with our why. Why are we in this education enterprise? Why do we choose to do this work day in and day out? And what is our hope for this enterprise? What is our hope for ourselves? So for instance, you want to start thinking about, and what I encourage is that you start thinking about or continue to think about your personal why for being an inclusive leader. Some of the things I think about, for instance, are I want to interact with people graciously as individuals, but I also want to show understanding that group membership is a part of everyone's makeup. I also want to be sensitive to the fact that people have a wide variety of identities. Some of them are visible, others are not so much. But I also want my personal legacy to be that of a person who's positive and responsive to a wide variety of people. And in my presence, I want people from all backgrounds to feel visible, valued, and validated. And what I mean by those 3 V's are, I understand that people want to be visible. They may not want to be up front, they may not want to be on stage, but people do want to be seen, heard, and known. What I mean by value is that people want to be appreciated for what they do, but also for who they are. The other V, validated. People want to be accepted for who they are. While we may have ideological differences or move through the world differently, people still want me to accept them the way they show up in the world. And so those are my whys for becoming an inclusive leader. Anyone who is interested in being an inclusive leader over time has to consider being an inclusive person. So some of the things we might reflect upon are include how are we interacting with other people, because our interactions, and it's through our interactions that we make someone's day or we break someone's day. Maya Angelou used to say, people may not remember what we say, people may not remember what we do, but people will remember how we make them feel. So how do we interact with others, and how do we make people feel? And when we ask, how do we make people feel? Good, bad, indifferent, warm, fuzzy, calm, stressed, however we make people feel, is that how we make everyone feel? Do we offer equal opportunity joy or equal opportunity sorrow? Do we reserve our goodness for some and withhold it from others? And we also want to know, how are we growing through our personal relationships? So things to consider for our professional why, especially as educators or working in the education enterprise, is we want to make sure the students have a positive experience. And not just our students, we want to make sure the students have a positive experience, of course. We also want our colleagues to have a positive experience with us. We want visitors to the campus to have a positive experience. And then when we go out beyond the campus to represent the campus, we want people to have a good reflection of the campus through us. So for students, we know that having an overall positive experience has an impact on enrollment, on retention, on graduation, just as for employees, an overall positive experience has an impact on job satisfaction, retention, and turnover. So some of our professional reflections might be, for whom are we recommending forward moving? As an inclusive leader, who am I recommending for interviews, for faculty and staff appointments, for leadership appointments? Who are we recommending for opportunities such as fellowships, committees, and leadership development? We ask ourselves, for whom are we writing references? And we know as credentialed professionals, it adds gravity to a student or colleague's candidacy when we actually recommend them or serve as a reference for them. Yet another question might be, are we inclusive or exclusive in sharing the heft of our power? We might ask, who are we noticing and why? Who are we ignoring and why? Whose talents, gifts, and abilities do we notice? Whose deficits and limitations do we notice? Who are we mentoring? And who are we coaching? We also ask, how are we growing through our professional relationships? Who are we mingling with? Who are our friends and why? Are we ranking people or linking people? Are we only connecting with people who are like ourselves or in our same season of life or our own station in life? Just really, how are we using our professional relationships to grow? We know that national research offers quite a few benefits about diversity and inclusion in the literature, and in higher education in particular. The literature speaks of diversity and inclusion having a positive impact on student development, on educational outcomes for all students, regardless of background. And higher education can create safe spaces, but also brave spaces for students to cultivate inclusive principles, adopt inclusive language, and engage inclusive practices in ways that are not so high stake. Then, of course, we also know the educational enterprise as a marketplace has advantages when it gives attention to diversity and inclusion. For instance, greater organizational decision-making, better retention, enhanced public relations, thoughtful social responsibility, and in many cases, increasing the bottom line. The interesting part about this aspiration to be an inclusive leader over time is that it's hard to interact with people in deep and meaningful ways because we tend to be segregated. We're segregated in how we live and how we love, how we learn, how we work, how we play, how we worship, and in some cases, even how we die. And we also know that each of us has a different American story. And then there are historical messages that attend our different identities. There are different stereotypes. For instance, we get stereotypes from mass media, social media, newspapers, entertainment, TV shows, radio, movies, all of that. But our educational institutions also give us those stereotypes to run with if we're willing to do so. We determine who's considered to be intellectual or not, what majors are most valued, as opposed to seeing majors as alignment with different talents, gifts, and abilities. Our educational institutions sometimes categorize who are the dreamers, the thinkers, and the doers. And then, of course, our geographical areas play a part in that as well. In all of our geographies, for instance, urban, suburban, or rural, we think about who's in them, what's in them, what happens in them. And so there are other stereotypes to run away with. So what this does for us in our interactions and in our aspirations to be inclusive leaders is it makes many of our conversations identity conversations. The more I reflect, the more I'm learning that so many of our conversations are identity conversations. Now, the topic, you may be in a committee meeting and the topic may be recruitment or curriculum, retention or graduation rates. But when people don't know us, when people perceive themselves to be different than us, when there is a power differential or somebody has higher organizational power, we tend to be having identity conversations and we don't know we're having them. Because the people in the space who are considered to be at the lower ranks are wondering, I would say the people at the lower ranks and the people who are perceived to be different, all during these professional conversations we're having, they're actually asking themselves, do you like me? Do you think you're better than me? Do you think I'm smart? Do you think I care about this? I know the evidence might be there, but do you think I care about this? I may not be getting an A in your class right now, but do you think I care about the topic? Do you think I'm trying? Do you think I'm competent? Do you think I'm a good person? And ultimately, do you think I belong here? So all of these things are happening in our organizations. So one of the things we've done at our institution is we have adopted a DBIE model. And it's from the Disruptive Educational Equity Project that many of us have gone through for our professional development in this area. So rather than conflate the term diversity, which is what we tend to do, we conflate all of these terms around people feeling like they're okay in our spaces. We have decided to use DBIE. So with diversity, of course, we're still counting and measuring, because if we don't know what we're doing, how we're succeeding. So we continue to track those social identities that people are accustomed to us addressing. But we know that diversity is important, but it's not sufficient, because we can actually have diverse communities. We can actually have diverse institutions of higher education, but people don't have a sense of belonging. So we also are working very diligently on helping people to cultivate a sense of belonging and really alleviating the alienation and isolation that people feel, so that everyone can feel like they belong across their differences. And then we look at leadership diversity, and we're also talking about having the different social identities represented in leadership, but we're also talking about thought diversity, because we know that decisions are made that impact the entire organization. So we need to have the representation there, but we also need to have the people who are at the table representing the people who are not at the table, as opposed to only representing ourselves and our own agendas, if you will. And then for equity, we're looking closely at a lot of our data. because we want to alleviate those gaps, those disparities, and those disproportionalities, and remove the predictability of outcomes that we tend to have for our historically underrepresented groups. So when we think about DBIE, let's unpack the systems and structures that attend those. So first, when we look at diversity, we look at some of the systems, for instance, admissions and what are the criteria there. We look at position descriptions, job qualifications. We look at coded language that might show up. We look at the inclusive interview process and dialogue and determine if that's exactly what we're having. We also think about the systems and structures that impact belonging. That could be the events, the organizations, and the initiatives that we have. Do they attract a cross-section of students? Do they attract specific groups? How do we help people to cultivate that sense of belonging? And we do want to make a note about belonging being different than fitting in. So many students feel compelled to come to our spaces. So many underrepresented groups come to our campuses and feel like they have to fit in. Well, when we fit in, a part of that is we're asking someone to abandon parts of yourself to be who we are, as opposed to allowing people to show up authentically themselves, to show up fully themselves, and then to contribute to the campus in the ways that only they can. We also, when we're thinking about belonging, we audit our event organizations and initiatives for demographic participation. When we think about, sorry, I accidentally put that back. And when we're thinking about inclusion, we're thinking about auditing our divisions, our colleges, and our departments for demographic leadership. And in those decision-making spaces, whether it's a supervisor, a coordinator, manager, chair, director, dean, AVP, VP, really getting a sense of whether or not they're representing all of the people that are within their division or within their areas, not just advancing our own understandings. So when we look at systems and structures that impact equity, we're taking a deep dive into our grades by demographics, which has been really telling for us. We're looking at the courses by demographic, who has D's, withdrawals, fails, who's failing them, who's not completing them. It's really telling when we look at that information by demographic. We're also starting to look at our pay by demographics, market analysis of pay, and who and what determines leadership development, and who's given opportunities to serve as interim or acting leaders, and just a host of other things that help us to look at our structures to see how our systems and structures are impacting our equity. So one other slide I want to share with you is the slide on, I call them the 5 Ps, the 5-point model for inclusive leaders. And first being perspective taking. So really being able to hear the voice, the story, and the truth of others who are unlike ourselves. And asking ourselves, when someone tells us their story and it's not our personal experience, do we believe them? Or do we police their stories and give them our interpretation of what they experienced, as opposed to allowing them to have their own lived experience? Because the way we experience something and the way somebody else experienced something, both can be true at the same time. So it's just honoring the stories of others. And then we look at our presence and where we show up. So what programs do we attend on campus? What events do we attend? Because those demonstrate our support for DBIE. Also, when we look at who we're positioning to become successful in our organizations, we've talked about that a little bit, leadership development opportunities, serving as interims, acting as an acting leader, if you will. And then when we look at promotion, we advocate for and promote DBIE in all of our spaces and in all of our forms. And we also look to equity when we talk about prosperity, making sure people from a variety of backgrounds prosper in our purview, which includes thriving emotionally, financially, and otherwise. So I'm going to go ahead and close my original talk and then open the floor for dialogue and conversation. So I always like to share with people my reasons for being a part of this work. As Dr. Cooper mentioned, as a child, I was present for Dr. King's final speech. And that was because my grandfather was a sanitation worker in Memphis, where I grew up, and Dr. King returned to Memphis for the sanitation workers. So my parents were involved in the civil rights movement, involved in the marches, and specifically the sanitation worker strike. So my family decided that we were going to attend when we heard that Dr. King was going to be at this particular event. And even though I was a child, an elementary age child, this brief time in his presence was a defining moment for me. I saw up close and personal that one person could choose to move through the world inclusively. Even though he had a PhD, he could be considered as someone who had made it. He chose to move through the world inclusively. He chose to lift as he climbed. He chose to care and be kind. He chose to leave the world behind him better than the world was before him. And while my life is clearly not on the scale of his, I can still do the same things within my sphere of influence. I can participate in human flourishing and not human suffering. I can continue to ponder the intent and the impact of my life. I can still ask myself in my presence, who feels visible, who feels valued, and who feels validated, but also ask myself who feels invisible, who feels insignificant, and who feels invalidated. I ask myself in my presence, who feels lifted and lowered, in my presence, who feels hopeful and hopeless. And I continue to ask myself, am I a dream breaker or am I a dream maker? So as we end our time together, I hope you are inspired to believe in your own potential, possibility, and promise for serving as an inclusive leader, as an individual, at the university, and in your organizations and associations. I offer the best to you, and the floor is open to questions and dialogue.
Dr. Webster, I appreciated your presentation. There's the last part in particular, asking those questions. I think that the contrasting questions was meaningful for me to be able to sit and think about that. And also, I think meaningful that if I have an answer, particularly for the ones that if a vision or a person or a name pops into my head around somebody, especially maybe on the part of that binary that is not the part that I actually want to be playing in that person's life. And so kind of taking the time for the reflection on that piece. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Our reflections are everything. One of the things that I find myself doing now at night to be even more intentional about this is I review my calendar at night to see who I will be meeting with. And most times I know who I'll be meeting with. Now I get walk-in traffic, phone calls that I don't expect, but for the most part, I know who I'm meeting with. Now, sometimes it's an individual, other times it's a meeting that has lots of people. But in both cases, I try to, if it's a committee meeting, I literally try to go around the table and visualize the faces of the people who will be there to think about what might I notice about them that's good. What might I notice about their contributions to the committee? It could be something as not relating to their career. It could be their necklace. It could be, the color they're wearing that day. But I really go around and try to visualize, how might I be a light in that person's life today? Because the interesting thing is, all of us are going through stuff, and we never know what people are going through. People show up every day with a brave face and do what they need to do, but we never know what they're going through. And just someone knowing that they were visible to me matters to them. So I really try to go out of my way to do that, and to just, think about, have I ever had any strained conversations with this person, or intense dialogue with this person that I need to make sure that I tread more gingerly this time? How might I say things more kindly to the person? And of course, thinking about, for instance, when I'm going to share ideas in a meeting, how might I share them in ways that connect us as opposed to disconnect us? So the reflection piece has really become a part of who I am, and it's really been helpful. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, I'm going to ask another question.
Sure.
One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and you mentioned it in your presentation, is there's a lot of conversation around examining systems and policies and documents and structure around ways that we've inherently maybe built in things that may perpetuate the things that we're actually trying to dismantle. And you gave some examples. I'm curious about an experience that maybe you have, an example that you may be able to share where you did some of this examination of a policy document, something like that, and how you reworked it, or any kind of resource around how we can, I don't want to say I'm looking for a rubric, but I'm looking for some kind of thing where I can take a new lens to a policy or a structure or procedure that might help us understand where we might be able to make changes to be more inclusive. Does that question make sense?
Sure, it does. So, and my mind was like all over the place, but I'll try to give a few examples. So, for instance, in the work of our Diversity Advisory Committee, we have probably 10 subcommittees that are working on different challenges for the campus. And one of those is the Black male experience, because on our campus, our young Black men are achieving at the lowest rates, they're being retained at the lowest rates, they're graduating at the lowest rates. So we, under the auspices of that subcommittee, we conducted a study where we had focus groups with the young men to ask fairly pointed questions about their UCA experience. And one of the things we came away with was they show up here and they have, I want to say, an average of a high school GPA of 3.2. It's very decent. By the end of their freshman year, or their first year, many of them have just flatlined. We're like, OMG, what's going on? So long story short of that particular study is we realized that they were having great social opportunities on campus. Our office in particular has a lot of activities and organizations for them to plug into, become leaders, really develop their decision-making skills, and even mentor younger students once they're here. So their social experience with UCA has been amazing. it's in the classroom is where things are falling apart. And so now we just finished a second study with that committee to ask more pointed questions about the academic experience, because we were thinking it was more of a belonging question. And it wasn't a belonging question for this particular group. It was more of a equity question in the classroom. So we're finalizing our executive summary on that. And so what we'll do is take that, we'll basically kind of go on a roadshow. We'll share it with the provost. We'll present it to the council of deans. We'll present it to the council of chairs, and then we'll present it to the entire campus and let the campus know this is what students are experiencing. And then what I do along with our Center for Excellence in Teaching is we'll start developing professional development for faculty to help with those particular areas. So that's one thing I would say we've done, and we've done that over and over again for different subcommittees. Something that just came up recently, we have a new international faculty, and we have lots of international faculty, but this one particular one called because she wasn't able to get her driver's license, and because she couldn't get that, she couldn't get insurance for her car, she couldn't get, it was just a domino effect of all the things she couldn't do because she couldn't get that. And so I spoke with the general counsel here, who pretty much handles all of our immigration issues, that we handle internally. Some of them we pay other people to handle. But anyway, we started seeing some holes in our system. Now, a few years ago, we noticed that our international faculty needed more help. And we designed an international guidebook that was very helpful. But because of this experience, we realized, okay, there are some other holes that we can do something about. So one of the things we're going to do is actually have a session on the immigration process at UCA. Now, we know it's different for every country. We know it's different depending on the type of visa that a person has, but we're going to have this open forum so everybody's hearing the same message, because different colleges and different departments talk about how they're going to handle those with international faculty differently. So those are just some of the ways that we find out what could be going wrong, what could be our challenges, what can make people not want to stay here, not feel like they belong here, not feel like leadership is listening to them, or not feel like something's inequitable for them. We have a lot of ways that we do that. Sometimes we have, for instance, admissions will come to the Diversity Advisory Committee and make a presentation. And then we as a committee start asking the questions to ensure that, yeah, this sounds right, this sounds fair, but we also might say, hey, what about this? What about that? So it's in those venues that typically happens. And then we design professional development around them. For instance, over the summer, for the first time, we had a Teaching Excellence Institute. And I was responsible for leading the inclusive pedagogy part of that. But in addition to inclusive pedagogies, we had a big block on, I think we had 10 hours on inclusive pedagogy, 10 hours on the science of learning. We had 10 hours on the UCA student population. So we can actually give them the profile of UCA students, because, we all come from different universities and we assume students are kind of the same at each one, but each student population is very unique as well. So we talk to them about, this is who shows up here. Most are in poverty. Most parents can't contribute to their education. Most don't have reliable technology. Most don't have reliable transportation. So we talk about those kinds of things. And I think the other section was on, I'm drawing a blank, but anyway, there were 4 blocks of 10 hours of training. But again, that was for faculty, and it gives faculty an opportunity to really plug into what's happening at the entire campus level and all the ways we're working on those kinds of things for inclusion.
Mhm.
That was
Thank
a
you so
really
much.
long answer. So sorry.
It's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Dr. Webster, I have a question.
Mhm.
Mental health has been something that has been a trend, something that has impacted entire campuses. What have you done as a senior leader to kind of aid in this situation at your campus?
Well, one of the things our office has been trying to do for the last several years is to destigmatize seeking help for emotional wellness. In so many communities of color in particular, it's still kind of a hush situation, or we don't necessarily believe in that. And, you know, what happens at home stays at home. You shouldn't be telling anybody about that. And so we're really working with our counseling center to connect with our different minority student organizations in particular. Now, they connect with all kinds of organizations, but our work is to help them to connect with our minority student organizations, to talk to them about it. For instance, we have a Black Graduate Student Association, and last fall we have one Black counselor in our unit. So we had her to talk to the Black graduate students, because we know graduate students are under stress because many of them are also working full time. So, I mean, we're just doing whatever we can do to mitigate those stereotypes about counseling. My VP, the counseling director, and I are going to be meeting soon about, was it an ACE, American Council on Education article around mental health and students of color. So we've all read that article, and we're going to be huddling to see, okay, what can we do different? We have this new information. Now what can we do? So it's important. It's something that is real. It's real here, and we're doing what we can to mitigate it. Anything that I said that makes you go, I need to know more about that. I'm willing to talk about it. So I would like to ask you all then, and what, based on just some of the things I said, what action steps might you take to solidify your role as an inclusive leader so that it's demonstrable, so that other people will notice that you are intentionally working to fulfill that aspiration or to take it further?
I think for me, what I would like to do is I think one thing that I can do is share, I think the P's that you shared, and even talking about, we've talked about it, I think in the university, really looking at diversity and really putting that belongingness emphasis in there, as you stated in there, but looking at those kind of the 5 P's and some of the ways, and sharing with my leadership team my intention, and kind of helping us have a language around that. So, because part of it is, I may think that I'm, trying to, I may think my actions are having the impact I want them to have, because that's my intention, but that doesn't always happen. And so sharing and having dialogue around, what would this look like if I was behaving in a way that was congruent with being an inclusive leader? And what might it look like if I'm stepping outside of that? And that way, we have a language around which we can talk to each other, and I can get feedback from them, and we can talk about how as a team we want to also be working together on this. And so involving leadership, the leadership team, other people in that, so we can continue to have dialogue and really thinking about when we're acting in that congruently and when we may not be.
Mm-hmm. You know, the dialogue piece is very important. I just spoke with someone yesterday who asked an African-American female to lead a book group. And the African-American said, great, yes, I want to do it. And led the book group, everything was great, had good feedback from the participants, but the African-American woman didn't have warm, fuzzy feelings at the end of it. And a part of it was, I mean, once we talked about it with the other leader, the white leader who asked if she would want to lead the group, asked her because she knew she was competent, she could do it, she would be great. And then she didn't attend, the white leader didn't attend any of the book group sessions. And so the African-American thought, well, I've been a part of 5 different book groups and you're always a part of them. But for mine, you weren't a part of it. And the white leader was saying, well, I didn't come to yours because I didn't want you to think that I was supervising you. And I didn't want you to think that I didn't have confidence that you could do it. So we just have these cultural mismatches that occur. And so when we finished talking, as we talked through it, I asked, so do you wish you had more support? And she's like, yeah, I wish I had more support. And these 2 women are friends. So these are not people who have bad blood or anything, but they just didn't go the extra step to have that conversation about, okay, what will this look like? What are your expectations? What are your expectations? How might I support you? What's going to make you feel smothered? What's going to make you feel like I don't trust you? Just the extra dialogue could have taken care of much of it. So the communication really is important because we're thinking of in our own lived experience. And, they say the difference between intent and impact is intent is what's happening in your head and impact is what's happening in real life. And then we know Dr. Brene Brown talks about the stories I'm telling myself is this. And each one of them was telling themselves a story about the other person that wasn't true, but very believable to each person.
Absolutely. I've had some of those experiences recently where, and I think this is a recognition of when we're in a position of power and how much power is assigned to us. And trying to be very, very conscious of that so that I am using that power with and power for and not power over. Sometimes just automatically perceived because of that, of the role. Thank you.
Sure. Dr. Cooper, how else would you like to spend the other time, or are you releasing us, or how would you like for us to do it?
If everyone could please complete the survey link in the chat. Also, you will receive an email with this recording, and anyone can request it via email as well. Thank you so much for attending today. We look forward to seeing you next week at the 3rd Annual Equity and Inclusion Conference. Today is the last day to register, but thank you again to Dr. Webster, and everyone have an awesome Wednesday.
Thank you. And I'll send the PowerPoint to you, Dr. Cooper.
All right, thank you.
Okay.